Hey folks, this is Rhykker, and we're here to talk about upcoming action RPG, No Rest for the Wicked. We're here with the co-founders of Moon Studio. Gentlemen, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, I'm Thomas. I'm the creative director at Moon.
And I'm Gennady. I do production and technical works.
Now, you guys are best known for the Ori series. How do you get that jump from a platformer to an action RPG?
Well, I always liked the analogy of like when Nintendo back in 1985 ran from Super Mario Bros. To Zelda in the next year, right? When we did Ori, I always felt like, hey, that is kind of our Mario because it was a Metroidvania, but it was really a platformer at heart, right? Like, because it was so platforming focused. And I thought it would just be cute, right? Like when we did the first prototypes, hey, what would happen with all that, with that team that we had and with that art style and all of the stuff, right? If we start doing a top-down action adventure thing, right? Then kind of went from there.
We worked on Ori for about 10 years. We did 2 of those games. We kind of really figured out our way in this genre, our own statement. And why not make Ori 3? Why not just keep going and do that kind of thing? Well, first of all, we really liked the challenge and not staying in our comfort zone. We felt like after 10 years, we needed to try something else. And we, Thomas and I, we grew up with these games. This is our childhood. This is, we played these games. We even use this phrase religiously. We grew up with all of those actions, starting with Diablo 1. This is our childhood. These are the games we love to play. And we just felt that there is more that could be done. And it didn't seem like anybody was doing it. It's not that something we finished Ori 2 and we're like, okay, what do we do next? Okay, let's do an action RPG. It was like, no, we dreamt about this for a long time. We wanted to do it. We even considered doing this right after Ori 1. But
I think actually the whole thing that we did on Metroidvania before put us into a pretty unique position to make an aRPG, right? Because with Metroidvanias, it's this whole building a huge connected world. And so with aRPG, right, what we wanted initially right from the start was we'll build a fully connected world, and we will handcraft it, and we will make sure that we fix that retention thing, right, by just designing levels again and again, right, so that whenever you get to an area, you have a different experience. But in many ways, like just that experience from over 10 years of building Metroidvanias, right, went straight into, okay, now we build a fully 3D connected world for an aRPG.
And you guys are taking a different approach to the aRPG.
Yeah, so the thing that we see, right, is that you basically have the Diablo-likes on one side and then the Souls-likes on that side, right? And we were kind of like approaching it from a completely new angle, and we are a smaller indie studio, right? So we looked at what can we do to really advance the genre, right? So similar to how we did it in Ori, right? Like we looked at what were the Metroidvanias that came before and what can we do to contribute there. And then it was the same thing there, right? So we started with, for example, combat. And we looked at what do we like about the combat and the systemic nature that these Diablo-likes work, right? But then also we looked at, well, what did the the Eastern kind of like studios, the Japanese studios and so on do in recent years, right? And because a lot of times with these Diablo-likes, the combat was like left mouse button, clicking, right? The combat, right, like in 96 or something, when Dave Brevik decided with Diablo 1, right? Like, hey, I click this button, the character walks over there and immediately does the hit, right? We just kind of like everything since then has just been a little evolution of that, right? And it became faster and spammier and so on, right? And like lots more explosions on screen and so on. And I do think, again, we did feel like, hey, the next step would be, let's take a step back from that, right? So it's not just click spam and like lots of explosions and big damage numbers on screen, right? But well, like, no, let's actually, really use those animations, right? So that the player really has to figure out, okay, how do these enemies try to attack me? And then be very precise, right? Like give the player ultimate control over their character. And like in that moment, I need to do a dodge roll, and then I need to do this particular attack and so on. So just create something that's really, really precise.
Now, you were mentioning how the aRPG sort of came to be from a turn-based game when David Brevik decided, hey, let's just try to make it go live action. And then since then, the gameplay has sort of remained the same, where it is spamming buttons, clicking. There isn't so much attention paid to maneuvering, to counterplay towards enemies, which leads the games to ultimately evolve at Endgame towards just spamming buttons against hordes of enemies. So in what way, you mentioned animations, for instance, from a play experience, in what way will players feel the difference right away when they dive into their first few enemies in No Rest for the Wicked?
I think you'll immediately feel that it's very different from any other action RPG, top-down action RPG, right? Because the thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to fuse a bunch of things, right? Like we like a lot of what these Diablo-likes have been doing, right? Like the retention elements, the whole, hey, when I find a weapon, it's never quite the same. And loot could always be in different places and so on, right? At the same time, we really like the whole animation commit system, where if you do a heavy attack, well, you actually have to commit to that. And so you notice that change right from the start, right? That when you fight with enemies, that you really have, like spacing matters and weight matters and timing matters. Every single weapon that you get in the game, we were crazy enough to say, let's make completely different moveset for it, right? Completely different animations and so on.
So not just the difference between a bow and a sword, but even a sword and an axe, or even different types of swords are going to give a different feeling.
Or even the same sword based on the different affixes and the RNG systems that we have on top.
Can you give an example of like what would one moveset be?
Let's take the typical straight sword, like a blood-rusted sword, right? Where you have like your typical swipe from right to left, then another swipe from left to right, and then a thrust attack. And the thrust attack deals extra poise damage, right? So now you actually need to kind of like dance with the enemy and understand exactly when do I get my hits in, right? Because you will want to know when do I interrupt an enemy, right? And the more poise you have, the poise attack that you deal, the more likely it is that you'll get to interrupt enemies. So those are all things that players have to play with. Obviously, that has a huge effect on how many enemies we throw at you and so on, right? Especially at the start. Like we want to make all of that feel very precise and almost make it feel like a dance, right? Mm-hmm. Where you have to understand, oh, that enemy is doing this, right? And I'm always having to react, right? And now is the right time to actually hit. And again, like similar to Souls games and so on, you have this whole thing where it's like, well, and then if you're too greedy and you start spamming, we'll punish you for it a little bit, right? And you have to adapt to enemies' behavior and so on. And once you get really good, that dance feels really satisfying.
Absolutely. I've experienced the being punished for spamming. Absolutely. It's a different mindset you need to adopt, in that the gameplay itself is rewarding when you pull off a good combo, as opposed to just, again, it's not just spam clicking. The attack animations, they're not just a visual. If the enemy is moving a certain way, well, if you swung that way, you might miss, but if you swung the other way, you might hit.
Especially if they're dodging, if they're using their dodge moves, if they're trying to parry you, if they're trying to block you, all of these things really count. But to your point, it's the animation of it, the weight of it, the feeling of viscerality and immersiveness in that combat. So on top of this mechanical foundation that we're talking about, so all of these things are really precise, they're really strategic, they're intelligent, there is a lot more depth there. We wanted everything to feel super punchy and super tactile, and for every single action you have, there is feedback.
I think it is also just kind of like, again, like what is the next step, right? Because like the early RPG started with, oh, I'm hitting the enemy and the weapon physically connects with the enemy, but you get a miss, right? And we don't do that kind of stuff anymore, right? Like, because our weapons, there's actual colliders on the weapons, right? So you only get a miss if your weapon actually misses the enemy, right? And when the weapon hits you, it's a hit.
Now with Ori, as a platformer, level design, incredibly important. You were touching upon procedural generation. A lot of aRPGs, well, ever since even technically Diablo 1.
It's almost unwritten rule that you have to have procedural generation.
Yeah. Which comes with downsides and positives. So why do you feel, in your case, the way to go was with the handcrafted world, and how does that benefit?
I have a huge thing to say about that. So I built a ton of the levels for the Ori games, right? And I always it's so, level design to me is so close to my heart because it's so important, right? Especially for platformers and so on. And then whenever I played early RPGs, right, like you had to have procedural generation because retention. But then whenever you really played them, like the problem is once you do random generation, right, then you deal basically with a flat plane. You never have these cool moments where it's like, oh, but let me climb that mountain, right? And then I see this huge vista over there. And then I have to go over this rope bridge and the rope bridge falls apart. And then now I'm in this little crevice, right? So you can't really use verticality and so on because that's just not how the procedural generation works. So very early on, we decided we'll take a different direction, right? We'll do it very similar to how we did in Ori, where it's like, no, we'll handcraft the world, but then we'll use, we created the system we call Alive, right? Where, the first time you go into the Mariner's Keep, you'll be fighting the Risen, right? But then when you retraverse later on, oh, shit, now this area could be taken over by some beasts, right? Or some other enemies could be here. Or You could get a random thing where it's like, oh, now I go into the courtyard of the Mariner's Keep and there's a huge boss there, right? Those are the kind of moments that you want to have, like this huge, like every day I feel like, hey, I have to traverse through the world to get all the resources and items and so on that I need to upgrade my character or our town and so on. But I never know exactly what to expect.
I think we just have a really rock star level design team, and I think the way they can craft this world and direct the player experience is just, you just cannot build a procedurally generated algorithm that can create that feeling and really to orchestrate the right pacing of everything, integrate the story, which is a huge part of the game as well, the lore, the world building. It's not just the mechanics of the combat or the loot. It's also, we want to build a world that people can get lost in, that people can fall in love with. So how do you do that if it's just all randomly generated? And I think that's the difficult part. That's the challenge, basically, is to have this foundation, which is handcrafted worlds, handcrafted flow, the pacing is exactly right, but then bring in those end game elements and that variation and variety. And we do have a lot of randomization system, the Alive system, the Plague system, basically, that allows you to revisit the areas and experience them in a very, very different way. And we also take inspiration from other games. So for instance, one of our recent favorites is Hades. So we have an infinite dungeon we call Serum Crypts, where basically it's not exactly procedurally generated, but much closer to that other formulas. As Thomas was saying, we didn't just want to have these boxes necessarily, but we have something that is a lot more randomized, and then people can really grind their teeth against the challenges in there. And the idea is, have to basically descend and beat the dungeon.
The inspiration for that in many ways was, wouldn't it be cool in an aRPG that you build up your character, right? And you go through the typical, hey, I get my character to level 100, right? But then the end game is actually more roguelite, right? So it's like, oh, let's take that character and then let's flip it on the head, right? In Diablo 1, you had Tristram, and then you had the Sanctuary, and you had your 15 floors that you had to go down. What if that is your end game? What if you have to craft your character, you get to max level, and now that character and that stat level that you have with that equipment, right? Now you have to go through the toughest thing that is in the game, right? And if you have all your inventory and all of that stuff properly managed, right, you might be able to make it to that boss. And if you can kill the boss, right, you get a ton of good loot, right? That was kind of like the inspiration for that.
And there's a lot of also other end game elements in the overworld as well. So it's not, the end game in this game is not just the Serum Crypts, it's one option. And it's one thing, one of the things you can do, but also PvP, right? There's going to be some really cool PvP modes coming later in early access. What is really important to us is for people to know that, we're not doing like, oh, it's a Souls-like or it's a Diablo-like. We're trying to do our own thing. And we're trying to mix things in a way that just were not mixed before. And then we will release an early access. We will get all of this feedback. And our goal is to really get it right.
Now, you mentioned traversals, and I think this is another one of the advantages of this handcrafted world is there's, like I was seeing, there was so much to explore. There's so much like little nooks and crannies and hidden chests. And also with the way movement works in the game, you can have like dive attacks on enemies. You were showing me that you can drop down from a ledge. You can knock enemies off ledges, which is things that just we couldn't do or we've never really done in ARPGs before. Yeah. The control scheme, we're not going to have any point-to-click kind of movement, right? It's going to be controller and WASD. And
also mouse in a good way. So you could have more precision control over the direction of the attacks.
At least from my play experience, I don't think this kind of game could be done with a just like click on enemies, like with the amount of depth that you have to the combat maneuvers.
Yeah, I mean, we tried it, right? But the ultimate goal was, how do we give the player as much control over the character as possible, right? And with the whole old point and click thing, right? It's just, well, how do you, have the character hit and then dodge and then do this and then do that? It's really difficult because in like a lot of it was very simple, right? Before with ARPGs, where it's like you just point at something and then it does the action, right? But we needed more controls. Even again, like informed by the level design as well, right? Where you have these moments of like, oh, I need to actually be really precise over here because there's a thing that I need to balance over while enemies might be shooting at me and so on, right? And that's the thing where it's like, well, I don't just want to be able to click on the other side of that and the character does it automatically for me, right? I want you to, feel like, oh my God, I'm balancing over this cliff. If I fall, I'm dead, right? And now I need to do it really precisely. So those, that's really cool.
Yeah, there's another part that I noticed is that the world, I mean, a lot of it just seems like if logically your character would be able to kind of climb up that, hop on that, you could, as opposed to other games where it's just like, well, it's just geometry. that you cannot interact with in any
so
way.
that's the cool thing that you get from actually handcrafting the world, right? That you can just make it really interactive.
From my play experience, like a lot of the navigation of the world, everything feels very natural. You know, it's not like press this QuickTime event to now jump or to balance yourself across this or to climb.
And we wanted to do this thing where it's like, oh, there's a treasure chest over there, right? How in the world do I get there, right? So then you need to figure out, oh, I need to climb these vines here, right? I need to kind of like balance over these beams here. Then I need to jump and, you know, grab onto this ledge and pull myself up. And now I can get to the chest.
So one of the first things players will notice when they load into the game is they're not picking a class.
Yeah.
So how does the soft class system work?
We actually started with classes, right? And then we realized that there's always a bit of a problem, right? Like you pick a class and then players play the same way. And we just wanted to do a thing where it's like, let's get rid of that, right? Like let's start you butt naked at the start, and then you design your class based on the items that you get and the tools that we give you, right? And we want you to be able to kind of like make up classes that we couldn't even think of, right? Simply because of, oh, I have this particular weapon with this enchantment, right? That allows me to do these kind of rune attacks and so on. And that was the idea, to not lock the player down in any way, which is also why we didn't go for traditional skill tree, right? Because a skill tree usually then means, oh, you can go this path, right? But lots of other players will also pick this path, right? Or if you play a paladin, then, oh, I'll go for the hammerdin, right? But I think the cooler thing is just let the players do their thing, right? Like just give them a whole bunch of tools, give them a whole bunch of ways of how to express themselves and be the character they want to be, and just let them do their thing, right? And all we should do as developers is just give you tons and tons of cool options.
It's like if you have a class system, it's almost like you're limited to X number of colors you can paint with, but we wanted to have all the shades of these colors. So what if people mix and it's like, oh, and now there is a heavy archer, or where there's a super heavy armored mage, or there's a super light heavy sword guy. Like, how would that feel? That's super cool. In a way, having a class system is kind of like, okay, I'm locking into somebody else's predefined preset of a fantasy, but I want to do my own thing. That's why the customization system is so rich, and people can do some really funky and amazing looking different customization options where the characters look really, really unique and different from one to the next. And we wanted the same thing to translate into the mechanics and to the way the builds work.
So people could still, run a full caster. They can just blast intelligence, because every time they level up, they get attribute points to strength, dex, and your standard array. So they can just blast intelligence. They can make a wizard kind of character, but they could also make a wizard
with a shield,
warrior hybrid. Yeah, exactly.
Like a spell sword and so on, right? That kind of.
Or they could have a lightweight barbarian with a huge axe, but like running, topless, basically, just using super fast movement sets, but a very heavy weapon. And all of that is possible, and like, why not? Let's see what happens, especially in early access. It's just like, let it out there, let people play with this, and let's really see what they come up with.
It will be pretty crazy. Like, and we're kind of like making ourselves vulnerable to some degree, right? Just that I'm sure there will be builds that are just nuts, right? But you have to be okay with that to a certain degree, right? They have to be okay with, just give people the systems. Some of them will go nuts with it, right? That's okay.
And so a build itself, it's going to look like what attribute points you've assigned. It's going to be what weapons you've selected.
Yep.
And then you mentioned weight classes. There's 3 different weight classes, which are going to affect how your character feels to play.
Yep.
How rapid their dodges are, what their attacks are looking like. And the weight class is determined by the kinds of armor you're wearing, correct?
And your load, equip load progression.
Like every weapon and everything that you basically have equipped, right? Determines, well, how heavy is your character, right? A light class kind of feels like this, right? And has access to these moves, right? And then a normal class has access to these moves, and heavy has access to this. So that's the road that we're trying to go down right now. Class basically is what attributes are you skilling into, right? Then also what weapons do you pick? What enchantments are you going for? And enchantments are basically our version of affixes. Yeah, and then what moveset are you going for, right? Like that kind of thing. Like what does your character really feel like? And what runes do you use, right? Like what are the specials, the skills that you use?
Yeah, so let's talk more about that itemization. You were saying that there's the item base, then there's different enchantments that could be applied. You said there was normal, rare, cursed, and unique items, right?
Yeah, so we have the whites, which is normal, right? We have our blues that are rare items. Then we have right now they're purple, it's a cursed item, and then we have uniques. The idea with white was we don't want to have that much trash loot, right? We want white to be more like fully customizable, but you don't get enchantments. Then the rares are, you get 1 to 4 positive enchantments, right? First then means you get 1 to 4 really, really good enchantments, but you get 1 really big negative. And then unique just means, well, we as designers go and just make it really unique, right? This could be the Excalibur or something, right? Where we say, well, with this kind of weapon, you get these effects that you then don't get on your blues and your purples. And the thing that we're trying to do with our enchantments, affixes basically, is we're trying to keep them fairly simple as we possibly can. Just tell me, like, just give me bonuses that feel good, right? So instead of, hey, this deals maybe 5% damage on a Sunday afternoon to undead, right? It should be, no, just give me more stamina or something, right? Like, give me another hit, right? Or make me crush that enemy even harder, right? I think it needs to be like just a tactile, really fun bonus.
You mentioned customizing the items. Can we talk a bit about like what crafting options that we have with those items?
Yeah, so you find recipes, blueprints, and so on all through the world, right? And then, you need to find these materials. Generally with crafting, we took the approach that a dropped item is also usually like a couple of levels below a crafted item, because we want to make it really satisfying, right? When you get a crafted item, that it and you go out there, you get all the materials to actually craft an item that it feels really special when you get it.
And just to circle a bit back to the pace of the game and the amount of enemies on screen at a given time. We're not blowing up at Endgame, right? We're not blowing up screens of enemies instantly at the click of a button. You want to talk a bit more about the pace and why you settled on that pace?
Honestly, I was just feeling like, hey, this has become too much, right? Like I looked at, like, you just have to look at gameplay from the current aRPGs, and a lot of it is just lots of explosions on the screen, huge damage numbers, and
it's almost like just noise, basically, at some point.
And it becomes very noisy. And Endgame, a lot of times, is just everything explodes on screen and the skill goes away, right? And I think we still wanted to create a very skill-based game where it's more about, okay, well, if there's an enemy approaching you, right, it's a challenge. If there's 2 enemies, it's difficult. But if there's 3 or 4, that it's like, this is really hard, right?
Especially if they combine each other's abilities and complement. You have a ranger and then a brute, and they're like a super strong group against you. That's very hard to deal with.
The player should really be in this mindset of, how do I strategically, what is my tactic here if I fight against 4 enemies, right? Maybe I need to kite this enemy, and then this other guy I hold off with a rune, right? And that kind of thing, instead of just explosion, right? That's kind of,
and that's another really cool thing where you have you can actually have 2 weapons equipped at any given point in time, both for your main and also offhand. So you could have a bow for certain situations, and you would go, okay, let me deal with this situation, this part of the encounter with my bow, and then switch to my heavy sword, and then go and finish that group off. But I think it's really about amping up the ante, because you want that feeling of like, okay, well, holy shit, the game is really like getting harder, and the enemies become really, really crazy. But it's not about just putting more of them. It's taking the existing enemies and leveling them up in all kinds of ways. It's the stats, it's the movesets that they will have, it's the kind of AI that they have, so that it will become progressively harder and more challenging as you get better at the game.
Now, when it comes to town design, you guys went with one town hub that is basically a character of its own, isn't it? You want to tell us more about Sacrament?
Yeah, so the decision that we made there, right? Like we didn't want to be the kind of aRPG where it's like, hey, you have 100 towns, but they don't matter that much and they don't change that much, right? We kind of like took the more focused approach to say, we'll have one town, that town's name is Sacrament, and we want that to be as dynamic as we can, and like, let's turn it into the coolest thing we possibly can, right? Where you will actually like the characters in there, the vendors and all of that, right? And you will be able to shape it and customize it. But I always loved that idea, right? The idea that, oh, I'm going out there, I'm getting resources, I'm getting items and so on, and instead of just investing that into my character, wouldn't it be cool if you also have this base, right, that you can build up, and you're not just proud of the character that you built, but you're also proud of that town. And the cool thing is, well, later on with multiplayer, kind of like have to make these decisions of like, hey, do I invest these resources into my character, just into myself? Or do I invest these resources into making the town better and upgrading, like helping the smithy upgrade his building so that he can craft better stuff for all of us?
Yeah, I think it's really about that expression again, talking about the soft class system and how you can really customize your character. We thought, why can't you do the same thing for the town? It's almost like another character. So all of these customization options and the choices you make in terms of how you rebuild Sacrament are another way to get a different experience from that particular playthrough that you're going to be getting. And it is also coming back to the world building and creating that contrast where the world of No Rest for the Wicked is so brutal and so hard and cold, and there are all these plague creatures and enemies. And we wanted to have something that feels warm, that feels like it's your home. It's the place where you relax, and the pacing changes, and the music changes, and you can do all of these other things that you maybe don't do in the overworld, like farming and crafting and talking to these NPCs. And as Thomas was saying, it's not about making them just functional, like, oh, here's the guy that gives me these things, and here's a guy that upgrades my weapons. But these are real people with real problems in a real world. And we try to infuse them with as much character, with the different voice acting and the different writing, so that we try to build a world around that town that is surrounded by this blight that's coming back in this dangerous environment. So hopefully that contrast, just in terms of the pacing of gameplay, is also going to be very healthy. And if you've beaten a super hard boss, you can relax for a little bit.
Now you guys are launching into early access.
Yep.
Why?
Exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Finally.
many years.
No pressure.
Not at all.
After just 6 years of development. Let's do this.
So why the decision to go with an early access launch?
As the years progressed and we've done Ori 2 and we've learned what makes Moon Studios unique, which is this culture of rapid iteration. It's constantly perfecting things. We love to sit down and see how everybody plays the game. We watched all of the Ori streams. It's an obsession for our team. And we just learn how people play the game, and we see issues and we see how we can perfect it. And perfect it is just our favorite thing to do. And with such an ambitious game, with all of these different ingredients and all of these big aspirations and co-op and PvP multiplayer and all of these systems and fusing all of these different ingredients, we want to get it right. So we know maybe not everything will work out day one, and we need to be okay with it. We need to be vulnerable and just let it out there and perfect it with the community.
It's a whole new approach for us, right? Because we made, like, both Ori products were boxed products before, right? So it was just at some point the game had to be finished and done, and that was it, right? And like any feature that didn't make it at that point is just done, right? It's cut and that's it. And so we were really excited about this idea of, like, it doesn't, like, not every single thing has to be there right from the get-go, right? And we don't have to make these decisions. We can launch a product, we can give it into people's hands as long as it's fun, right? I think people will be okay with that, but then we can iterate. So being able to continue on it, I think, is really exciting for us. And then listening to the community, hearing, okay, here's how they play, right? Here's the classes that they like, here's the builds that they play. How can we make that even more interesting? Here's the enchantments. Lots of people, I'm sure.
Forward to that, actually. Yeah, that will be so much fun.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people, I'm sure, will have lots of feedback for us, right? On, like, wouldn't it be cool with this? Wouldn't it be cool with that?
Especially on aRPGs. There are some people with opinions on the internet.
A couple.
And I think that's going to be really, really cool for us, right? The whole just being able to react.
With this, it's not that, like, oh, we didn't finish the game and it's, we're just releasing it and we're kind of winging it. We have prepared a lot of things for over 5 years. We have all of this foundation that we will be releasing gradually and reacting and fine-tuning. We just hope that people are going to be more open to that kind of release model. And I believe, and we hope, and we're working super, super hard to make sure this is a really polished early access launch.
Wonderful. Is there any other message you want to get out to the community?
I'd just like to invite all the all the fans of aRPGs, right, to take a look at No Rest for the Wicked. We built something, like we generally always make these passion products, right? Like we built Ori back then for all the fans of Metroidvanias, right? And No Rest for the Wicked has been built specifically for people like you, right? And like the aRPG community and so on. So, give us all that feedback, try the game, right? And tell us about it, so that we can improve it because we want to make it perfect.
Your input will really, really matter, and we will listen and we will adjust and tinker and perfect as much as we can. So the more of you that can jump in day one and help us get this right, the better. So hopefully we'll see you all on April 18th.